Before we begin, take a deep breath, settle in, and make yourself comfortable. If you're enjoying this video, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always amazing to see just how far our peaceful little community reaches around the world. Now, let's begin our journey through one of the most transformative and turbulent chapters in American history, the American Civil War. The origins of the American Civil War stretch back long before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in 1861. To truly understand this monumental conflict, we must go back to the very founding of the United States and trace the deep-rooted divisions that slowly but steadily grew over decades. When the United States declared independence in 1776, it did so with a vision of liberty, democracy, and self-determination. Yet, from the very beginning, the nation was burdened by a contradiction, the institution of slavery. Slavery was not a new phenomenon. It had existed in the colonies since the early 1600s, and by the time of the American Revolution, it was deeply embedded in the economy and society of the southern states. The northern states, while not immune to the practice, began to gradually move away from slavery after independence. This set the stage for a growing divide. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was a pivotal moment. The Founding Fathers, while crafting a new government, grappled with the issue of slavery, but ultimately compromised. They included clauses like the 3/5 Compromise, which counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation. They also allowed the transatlantic slave trade to continue until 1808. These compromises were meant to preserve unity, but they only postponed an inevitable reckoning. As the 19th century began, the United States expanded westward. With each new territory or state added to the Union, a pressing question arose: would slavery be allowed? This question became the central political issue of the time. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise attempted to strike a balance. Missouri was admitted as a slave state, while Maine was admitted as a free state. More importantly, slavery was prohibited in the rest of the Louisiana Territory north of the 36 degrees parallel. This temporary solution revealed the depth of sectional tensions. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, the abolitionist movement gained strength in the North. Figures like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and Harriet Beecher Stowe spoke and wrote passionately against slavery. Their words stirred the conscience of many Americans, while simultaneously enraging many in the South. Meanwhile, Southern leaders became increasingly defensive of slavery. They viewed it not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good. They argued that their way of life and their economy depended on enslaved labor. They pointed to the cotton boom and the South's export economy as evidence that slavery was indispensable. In 1846, the United States went to war with Mexico. The victory brought vast new territories under American control, including California, and much of the modern Southwest. This reignited the debate. Would slavery expand into these new lands? The Wilmot Proviso, introduced in Congress in 1846, proposed that slavery be banned in any territory acquired from Mexico. Although it failed to pass, it sparked fierce debates that foreshadowed the coming conflict. By 1850, the Union was teetering. The Compromise of 1850, a package of laws engineered by Senator Henry Clay, attempted once more to quell the tensions. California was admitted as a free state, and the Fugitive Slave Act was strengthened, requiring citizens to assist in the capture of runaway slaves and denying alleged fugitives the right to a jury trial. This compromise, like the ones before it, was a bandage on a growing wound. The moral and political rift between North and South continued to deepen. In the next section, we'll explore how the fragile peace unraveled during the 1850s, setting the stage for disunion and war. The 1850s were a decade of mounting tensions, rising passions, and violent confrontations that brought the United States ever closer to civil war. Though the Compromise of 1850 was meant to ease sectional strife, in reality, it planted seeds of further discord. One of the most controversial aspects of the Compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This law mandated that escaped slaves found in free states be returned to their masters, and it imposed harsh penalties on anyone who aided in their escape. For many in the North, this was intolerable. The sight of formerly free black people being seized and sent south, sometimes without proper legal process, stirred widespread outrage. Resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act took many forms. Personal liberty laws were passed in several northern states to counteract it. The Underground Railroad, an informal network of safe houses and secret routes, intensified its activities. Figures like Harriet Tubman emerged as legendary conductors on this path to freedom, risking their lives to help enslaved people escape to the North and even to Canada. The ideological and emotional battle against slavery reached a cultural crescendo in 1852 with the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The novel portrayed the brutal realities of slavery in vivid and heartbreaking detail. It became a bestseller in the North and was banned in many parts of the South. Abraham Lincoln would later greet Stowe by saying, "So, you're the little lady who started this great war." But literature was only one front in a much broader conflict. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act shattered the fragile peace once more. Authored by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, the act allowed settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, a concept known as popular sovereignty. This effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise line and opened the door for slavery to expand into areas where it had previously been banned. The result was chaos and bloodshed. In what became known as Bleeding Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas. each side determined to influence the outcome. Violence erupted as each faction formed its own government. Towns were burned, people were murdered, and civil disorder reigned. The symbolic center of the national debate had turned into a literal battlefield. Amid the turmoil, new political forces emerged. The Whig Party, one of the two dominant national parties, fractured over the issue of slavery. In its place, a new coalition formed, the Republican Party. Founded in 1854, it brought together former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, free soilers, and abolitionists. The Republican platform was clear: slavery should not expand into the territories. While the North was coalescing around this new political identity, the South grew increasingly alarmed. Southern leaders saw the rise of the Republican Party as a direct threat to their way of life. The old balance of power was shifting, and with it came a sense of dread. Tensions reached another flashpoint in 1856. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, an outspoken abolitionist, delivered a fiery speech attacking the Kansas-Nebraska Act and personally insulting its authors, including Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Days later, Butler's relative, Representative Preston Brooks, walked into the Senate chamber and brutally beat Sumner with a cane. The incident shocked the nation. In the North, Sumner was hailed as a martyr. In the South, Brooks was celebrated. The physical attack on a sitting senator was a grim metaphor for the state of the Union, bloodied, broken, and unable to engage in civil discourse. As the decade drew to a close, one final event would further deepen the divide: the Dred Scott decision of 1857. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had lived for a time in free states and sued for his freedom. The case reached the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Roger B. Taney delivered a sweeping decision. The court ruled that Scott had no right to sue because, as a black man, he was not a citizen. Moreover, it declared that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise and opening all Western lands to the possibility of slavery. The decision sent shockwaves through the North. It seemed to many that the highest court in the land had thrown its weight behind the slave-holding South. It also galvanized the Republican Party, which condemned the ruling and vowed to resist the spread of slavery with renewed determination. As the 1850s ended, the country stood at a precipice. Violence, political fragmentation, and judicial decrees had pushed the Union to the brink. All that was needed was a spark to ignite the flame of war. In the next section, we'll explore the final collapse of compromise and the road to secession. As the 1850s gave way to a new decade, the divisions between North and South had hardened into an unbridgeable chasm. The events of the past 10 years had revealed how fragile the bonds of union were. All that remained was for a match to be struck, and in 1859, one man would do just that. His name was John Brown, a fervent abolitionist. John Brown believed that slavery was a sin so vile It could only be purged with blood. He had already made a name for himself in Bleeding Kansas, where he and his followers engaged in violent actions against pro-slavery settlers. But his ultimate plan was far more audacious. In October of 1859, Brown led a small band of men in a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His goal was to seize weapons and ignite a massive slave uprising that would spread throughout the South. The raid failed spectacularly. Brown was quickly surrounded, captured, and later hanged for treason. But the true impact of the raid wasn't measured by its military success. It was measured by the shockwaves it sent across the country. In the North, Brown was seen by many as a martyr, a man who gave his life for the cause of freedom. The poet Ralph Waldo Emerson compared him to Christ. In the South, however, Brown was the embodiment of Northern aggression, proof that abolitionists were willing to use violence and insurrection to destroy the Southern way of life. Fear spread throughout the South like wildfire. Militias were formed, arsenals stocked, and a grim realization set in. The North and South no longer trusted each other. They no longer believed in each other's intentions. The bonds of brotherhood had been severed. As 1860 dawned, the United States stood at a political and cultural crossroads. The looming presidential election would determine the nation's fate. The Democratic Party, once a powerful national force, split along sectional lines. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Douglas, who supported popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats, outraged by Douglas's refusal to fully endorse slavery, chose John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, who backed federal protection of slavery in the territories. A third party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Their platform? Preserve the Union without taking a firm stance on slavery. But the most consequential candidate of all came from the new Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a former Illinois congressman and a moderate on the slavery issue. He believed slavery was morally wrong, but did not call for its immediate abolition in the states where it already existed. Instead, he opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, a position that terrified many in the South. In November 1860, Lincoln was elected President of the United States with less than 40% of the popular vote. He won no Southern states. For white Southerners, this was the final straw. They believed that Lincoln's presidency would mark the beginning of the end for slavery and the Southern way of life. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina took the unprecedented step of seceding from the Union. In a declaration filled with references to states' rights and the sanctity of slavery, South Carolina asserted its right to leave the Union voluntarily, just as it had joined it. Over the following weeks and months, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed suit. By February 1861, these 7 states had formed a new government, the Confederate States of America. They drafted a constitution that enshrined slavery as a protected institution and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln had not yet taken office. President James Buchanan, whose term was ending, believed secession was illegal, but also felt he had no power to stop it. The nation drifted, leaderless, toward disaster. When Lincoln was finally inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, he struck a tone of reconciliation and firmness. He declared that while he had no intention to interfere with slavery where it existed, the Union was perpetual and indivisible. He would not recognize the legality of secession. He would not initiate war, but he would defend the Union. The first test came in Charleston Harbor, where a small Union garrison was holed up in Fort Sumter, now surrounded by Confederate forces. Lincoln faced a choice: abandon the fort or resupply it, risking confrontation. He chose to send supplies. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. Though no soldiers died in the fighting, the event was momentous. The Civil War had begun. In the days that followed, 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined the Confederacy. The Union was fractured. Brothers would now fight against brothers. A nation founded on liberty was tearing itself apart over the question of human bondage. In the next section, we'll examine the early months of the war, the strategies, the first battles, and how both the Union and Confederacy prepared for a long, bloody conflict. As Fort Sumter smoldered and smoke rose from Charleston Harbor, the scope of what had begun became impossible to ignore. The nation had split not only politically and legally, but emotionally and culturally. A peaceful resolution was now out of reach. With the firing on Fort Sumter, the North was awakened. Across the free states, newspapers issued urgent calls to arms. Public sentiment, which had been divided just months before, rapidly coalesced around preserving the Union. Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Men from cities and farms alike responded, lining up in droves to enlist. But this mobilization had a consequence. It pushed more southern states, who had previously hesitated, into secession. Virginia was the most significant of these. Home to many of the nation's founding fathers, and strategically vital, its departure from the Union sent shockwaves through the North. Its capital, Richmond, would soon become the capital of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee, a highly respected U.S. Army officer and a native Virginian, declined Lincoln's offer to command Union forces. Though personally conflicted about slavery, Lee chose loyalty to his state over his country, resigning his commission and eventually becoming commander of the Confederate Army. Other Upper South states followed. Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina seceded, rounding out the Confederacy to 11 states. questioned the federal government's right to force states back into the Union. But Lincoln, ever careful with his language and politics, kept the focus not on abolition, but on preserving the Union. The Confederate Constitution, adopted in March 1861, mirrored the U.S. Constitution in many respects, but with clear protections for slavery. It limited the central government's power, reflecting Southern fears of federal overreach. Ironically, this emphasis on states' rights would later complicate the Confederate war effort, as cooperation between states and central command became difficult. As both sides braced for war, each believed victory would come swiftly. The South was confident in its military tradition and the skill of its officers. Many Southern men had military training and believed their defense of homeland and property would carry them to victory. The North, with its vast population, industrial base, and rail network, believed it could overwhelm the rebellion through sheer force and resources. But both sides vastly underestimated what lay ahead. In July 1861, the first major clash occurred. The First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, as it was called in the South. Union forces under General Irvin McDowell marched into Virginia, aiming to quickly capture Richmond and end the war. Confederate troops under Generals P.G.T. Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston met them near Manassas Junction. Spectators from Washington came with picnic baskets to watch what they thought would be a quick and glorious affair. Instead, they witnessed chaos. The Union Army was routed and fled back toward Washington. The myth of a short war was shattered. The Confederates, buoyed by victory, believed even more firmly in their cause. But even in triumph, they lacked the resources and infrastructure to capitalize fully. In the wake of Bull Run, both sides realized that this would be a long, grueling, and bloody war. Lincoln appointed General George B. McClellan to reorganize the demoralized Union Army. McClellan, a skilled administrator, transformed the ragtag troops into a disciplined force, but he would soon reveal a crippling caution on the battlefield. Meanwhile, in the West, another figure was beginning to rise, Ulysses S. Grant, a quiet, determined general who would eventually become the North's most successful commander. But in 1861, his story was only just beginning. The early stages of the war also revealed logistical and medical shortcomings. There were shortages of uniforms, weapons, and food. Disease spread rapidly in unsanitary camps. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, and battlefield surgery was often more dangerous than the wounds themselves. The war was not yet about slavery in the North. It was about preserving the Union. But for the South, it was increasingly clear. They were fighting to defend a system based on human bondage. As 1861 ended, both North and South settled in for a long conflict. Winter encampments formed, Strategies were refined. Maps were drawn. Families on both sides said goodbye to loved ones, not knowing if they would ever return. The wheels of war were in motion, and they would not stop easily. In the next part, we'll explore the war's early campaigns in 1862 and 1863, from bloody battles to bold plans, and how the conflict began to reshape the American identity itself. By the dawn of 1862, the Civil War was evolving from a quick rebellion into a full-scale conflict. The early skirmishes and shattered illusions of a short war had given way to organized campaigns, hardened soldiers, and an increasingly bitter national divide. Both the Union and the Confederacy were now fully engaged in a brutal contest of endurance, strategy, and willpower. One of the earliest turning points of 1862 occurred not in the East, but in the West. There, Union General Ulysses S. Grant began to make a name for himself. In February, Grant captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee. The victories were significant, not only because they opened a path into the Deep South, but because they signaled a new kind of leadership. Grant, unlike many of his contemporaries, was aggressive, decisive, and unafraid of casualties if it meant achieving strategic goals. When asked for terms at Fort Donelson, Grant famously replied, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender." Grant's successes earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant and boosted Union morale. But his next battle would be far more costly. In April, Grant's forces clashed with the Confederates at the Battle of Shiloh in southwestern Tennessee. It was one of the bloodiest battles the country had ever seen. Over 2 days of savage fighting, more than 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The scale of the carnage shocked the nation and signaled that the war had entered a far deadlier phase. In the East, the Union Army under George McClellan launched the Peninsula Campaign, a major effort to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond by advancing up the Virginia Peninsula. Though McClellan had a well-equipped army and numerical superiority, his characteristic caution and overestimation of Confederate strength slowed his advance. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, now in command of the Army of Northern Virginia, launched a series of aggressive counterattacks known as the 7 Days Battles, successfully defending Richmond and forcing McClellan to retreat. Lee's performance in these battles began to solidify his reputation as a brilliant tactician. Unlike many of his Union counterparts, Lee was bold and willing to take risks. He understood the importance of initiative and often sought to disrupt Union plans by going on the offensive. The summer of 1862 also saw the Second Battle of Bull Run, where Lee's forces, reinforced by Stonewall Jackson, defeated Union General John Pope and drove Union troops back toward Washington. With 2 victories at Bull Run, the Confederacy gained momentum, and Lee saw an opportunity. In September, Lee made his first major attempt to carry the war into the North. He invaded Maryland, hoping a Confederate presence in Union territory would demoralize the North. gain foreign recognition, and perhaps bring Maryland into the Confederacy. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. On September 17, 1862, more than 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Tactically, the battle was a draw, but strategically it was a Union victory. Lee's army was forced to retreat, and Lincoln seized the opportunity to shift the focus of the war. Just days after Antietam, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that as of January 1st, 1863, all enslaved people in Confederate-held territories would be forever free. This was a turning point. Until now, the war had been officially about preserving the Union. With emancipation, it gained a moral dimension. It became a struggle over the soul of the nation, over freedom, justice, and the future of slavery in America. The Emancipation Proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people. It applied only to areas in active rebellion, not to slave-holding border states loyal to the Union. But it redefined the purpose of the war and paved the way for black men to enlist in the Union Army, many of whom would fight bravely for their own liberation. The Confederacy, meanwhile, found itself increasingly isolated. Despite diplomatic efforts, neither Britain nor France recognized the Confederacy as a sovereign nation. Antietam and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation played a role in this. European powers, wary of aligning with a nation founded on slavery, hesitated to lend support. Cotton diplomacy had failed. As 1863 began, the war entered a new phase. 2 battles in the summer of that year would shift the balance once again, Gettysburg and Vicksburg. But even before then, blood continued to flow. In May 1863, Lee achieved perhaps his greatest victory at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Facing a Union army nearly twice the size of his own, Lee executed a daring flank attack led by Stonewall Jackson, throwing the Union forces into disarray and securing a remarkable victory. But the triumph came at a cost. Jackson was mistakenly shot by his own men during the battle and died of pneumonia days later. His loss was a heavy blow to Confederate morale. The Confederacy, battered but still defiant, was not yet defeated. Lee saw another opportunity to strike north, hoping to win a decisive victory on Union soil that might bring the North to the negotiating table. That opportunity would come at a quiet town in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg. In the next section, we'll examine the battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, twin Union victories that would mark the true turning point of the Civil War, and explore how the war was beginning to reshape the political and social fabric of the United States. As the calendar moved deeper into 1863, the war's strain weighed heavily on every part of American life. The Union and Confederacy both faced rising casualties, economic hardship, and political unrest. Yet amid this darkness, the seeds of transformation were also taking root. In the Union, the Emancipation Proclamation, though controversial, began to alter public opinion. Opposition to the war persisted in certain regions, especially among Copperheads, Northern Democrats who opposed Lincoln's policies and pushed for a negotiated peace. Some newspapers openly criticized the president, accusing him of overreach and authoritarianism. Lincoln walked a tightrope, balancing civil liberties with the necessity of preserving the Union. In New York City, tensions boiled over in July 1863. The implementation of the first federal draft law sparked the New York draft riots, one of the most violent episodes of domestic unrest in American history. Working-class men, especially Irish immigrants, resented a system where wealthier men could pay a $300 fee to avoid conscription. The riots, which lasted 4 days, devolved into attacks on black citizens, abolitionist symbols, and government institutions. Union troops returning from Gettysburg had to be deployed to restore order. In the Confederacy, the cost of war was equally devastating. The economy suffered under a Union blockade, which cut off vital trade routes. Shortages of food, clothing, and medicine became widespread. Inflation soared, morale eroded, and desertion rates rose in the Confederate ranks. Yet despite these hardships, Confederate resolve held, at least for the moment. Against this backdrop of national strain, 2 battles were set to unfold that would reshape the trajectory of the war and the nation itself. First, in the West, the Union turned its attention to the strategic stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Perched high on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River, Vicksburg was the last major Confederate bastion controlling the river. Capturing it would sever the Confederacy in 2 and give the Union control of a crucial artery. In the spring of 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant launched a bold campaign. Rather than attack the city directly, he conducted a series of flanking maneuvers, crossing the Mississippi south of Vicksburg and attacking from the east. After a series of battles, Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, and Champion Hill, Grant encircled Vicksburg in May and began a siege. For 47 days, Vicksburg's residents endured relentless bombardment and starvation. Civilians dug caves in the hillsides to escape the shelling. Food supplies dwindled to rats, mule meat, and leather. On July 4th, 1863, Confederate General John C. Pemberton surrendered the city. The fall of Vicksburg, along with the capture of Port Hudson shortly after, gave the Union full control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in 2. But even before the Stars and Stripes were raised over Vicksburg, another critical battle was being fought, this time in the east. On July 1st, 1863, Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee met Union troops under General George G. Meade at the crossroads town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. What began as a chance encounter escalated into a massive 3-day battle. On the first day, Confederate forces pushed Union troops through the town and onto Cemetery Hill. On the second day, fierce fighting erupted at Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Peach Orchard, as Lee sought to turn the Union flanks. The Union held firm, thanks in part to the heroism of units like the 20th Maine under Joshua Chamberlain, who defended the far left of the Union line in a dramatic bayonet charge. The third day brought Lee's most infamous decision, an assault on the center of the Union line at Cemetery Ridge, known as Pickett's Charge. Nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers marched across open ground under withering artillery and rifle fire. The charge was repulsed with devastating losses. Over half of the attackers became casualties. Lee's army, battered and bloodied, retreated back to Virginia. Meade, cautious like his predecessors, failed to pursue aggressively, but the victory was undeniable. The Battle of Gettysburg was the bloodiest of the war, with over 50,000 casualties combined. The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, won on July 3rd and 4th, marked the high tide of the Confederacy. Never again would the Southern armies seriously threaten Northern soil. From this point forward, the momentum began to shift decisively in favor of the Union. Lincoln, recognizing the significance of Gettysburg, visited the battlefield that November to deliver a short but profound speech at the dedication of the National Cemetery. In 272 words, the Gettysburg Address redefined the war not merely as a struggle to preserve the Union, but as a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could endure. It was a moment of moral clarity, a promise that the sacrifices made on that field would not be in vain. In the next part, we'll follow the war into its later years, where General Grant and General Sherman rise to prominence. Total war takes hold, and the Union begins to squeeze the life out of the Confederacy with grim determination. By 1864, the Civil War had entered its fourth brutal year. Hundreds of thousands were dead. Cities were scarred, families torn apart. Yet the end was not yet in sight. The year would be marked by relentless offensives, crushing attrition, and a transformation in how the war was fought. At the center of this shift was Ulysses S. Grant. After his victories in the West, Lincoln brought Grant east and made him general-in-chief of all Union armies. Unlike his predecessors, Grant wasn't afraid to engage Lee directly. He understood that the Union's advantage in manpower and resources meant that a war of attrition, though costly, would eventually break the Confederacy. Grant's strategy was simple and brutal. Press the enemy everywhere, all the time. He launched a coordinated offensive across multiple fronts, but the heart of his campaign would be in Virginia. There, he would go head-to-head with Robert E. Lee in what became known as the Overland Campaign. In early May 1864, Grant crossed the Rapidan River and engaged Lee in the tangled forests of the wilderness. The dense terrain nullified the Union's numerical advantage. The battle was chaotic, marked by wildfires that trapped wounded soldiers in burning thickets. Casualties were staggering, over 28,000 men in just 2 days. But unlike past Union commanders, Grant did not retreat. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he wrote. and fight it out he did. The campaign pressed south, from Spotsylvania to the North Anna River, and finally to Cold Harbor. At Cold Harbor, a massive frontal assault led to horrific losses. Nearly 7,000 Union soldiers fell in just 1 hour. Yet again, Grant pressed on. His goal was not just to defeat Lee, but to pin him in place while another Union army moved on a different front. That other front was led by General William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman, one of Grant's closest allies, launched his own campaign in Georgia, aiming to capture the vital rail and manufacturing hub of Atlanta. Facing him was Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, who skillfully delayed Sherman's advance with defensive maneuvers. But Johnston's caution frustrated Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who replaced him with the aggressive, but often reckless, John Bell Hood. Hood launched a series of desperate attacks, weakening his own army. Sherman took full advantage. After months of fighting, Atlanta fell on September 2nd, 1864. The capture of Atlanta was not only a strategic victory, it was a political one. At home, Lincoln had been facing stiff opposition in his bid for re-election. Many in the North were weary of war and considered voting for the Democratic candidate, George B. McClellan, who promised to negotiate peace. But Sherman's victory turned the tide. It rekindled hope in the Union cause and silenced the calls for surrender. In November 1864, Lincoln was re-elected decisively. The war would go on until the Union achieved unconditional victory. Following Atlanta, Sherman embarked on one of the most audacious campaigns in military history, the March to the Sea. With 60,000 men, he cut a swath through Georgia, living off the land, destroying railroads, burning crops, and targeting infrastructure. His goal was not to kill civilians, but to break the South's ability and will to fight. The concept, known as total war, marked a turning point in military philosophy. War would no longer be confined to battlefields. It would engulf society itself. Sherman reached Savannah in December and offered it as a Christmas gift to President Lincoln. Then he turned north, marching through the Carolinas, continuing his path of calculated destruction. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, Grant had laid siege to Petersburg, the rail center feeding Richmond. Lee's army was dug in, and the fighting bogged down into trench warfare that foreshadowed the horrors of World War I. For 9 grueling months, the two armies faced off in a series of deadly confrontations. The Union Army suffered and bled, but Grant would not yield. Back home, life in both the North and South was defined by uncertainty and grief. Letters from soldiers arrived less frequently. Black families, now free in some areas, began to seek loved ones lost in slavery's shadow. Churches, newspapers, and public meetings became forums for mourning and for hope. And yet, even amid the suffering, the nation was transforming. In January 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery in the United States. It would still need to be ratified by the states, but its passage through Congress was a seismic moment, a declaration that the war was not just about reunification, but about liberation. As the year closed, it was clear. The South was running out of options. Its armies were dwindling. Its economy was broken. Its cause, once wrapped in defiance and pride, now rested on fading hope. In the next part, we'll witness the final collapse of the Confederacy, the fall of Richmond, Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and the shocking assassination that would shake a victorious nation to its core. While Sherman carved his way through Georgia and Grant kept Lee bottled up around Petersburg, other critical developments were unfolding across the country, both on and off the battlefield. The year 1864 not only hardened the war's military course, it began defining the post-war future. In Washington, D.C., Lincoln's re-election gave his administration a renewed mandate. He took office in 1861, committed to preserving the Union. Now, as his second term approached, his mission had expanded. He sought not only to reunite the nation, but to remake it, to ensure that slavery would never again stain its soil. Lincoln's growing commitment to emancipation also meant closer attention to the role of African Americans in the war. By the end of 1864, over 180,000 black men had enlisted in the Union Army and Navy. These soldiers served with courage and distinction in dozens of battles, and endured harsher conditions and greater danger than white soldiers. One of the most powerful examples came earlier in 1863 at Fort Wagner, where the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, a black unit, led a heroic assault. Though the attack failed militarily, the bravery of its soldiers silenced many doubters. In 1864, black soldiers continued to fight across the South and into the Carolinas. Their presence on the battlefield and in many Union camps represented a visible shift in the nation's consciousness. The war was not only being fought to save the Union, it was being fought to fulfill the founding promise of liberty and equality for all. Meanwhile, Confederate hopes for victory increasingly rested on two fragile threads: the resilience of Lee's army and the possibility of foreign intervention. But by late 1864, neither seemed likely. Lee's forces were overstretched, exhausted, and suffering from severe shortages of food and supplies. And Britain and France, though sympathetic to the Southern cause in earlier years, had turned away. The Emancipation Proclamation had made support for the Confederacy politically toxic in Europe. Back home, the Confederate government under Jefferson Davis faced mounting internal dissent. States' rights, once a rallying cry for secession, became an obstacle to coordination. Governors resisted conscription orders. Food riots erupted in cities like Richmond. Inflation rendered Confederate currency nearly worthless. Desperation was taking root. At sea, the Union Navy continued to tighten its stranglehold. The Anaconda Plan, devised early in the war to blockade southern ports and control the Mississippi River, was nearly complete. Blockade runners became less effective, and southern trade dwindled to a trickle. The once booming cotton economy withered, and the southern populace, already enduring enormous hardship, sank deeper into despair. In November 1864, while Sherman prepared to leave Atlanta, Lincoln delivered one of the most important addresses of his presidency, his second inaugural. With victory on the horizon, he might have chosen to gloat. Instead, he struck a tone of solemn humility, with malice toward none, with charity for all, he said, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace. These words would echo through history. They signaled not just a desire to win the war, but to heal the country afterward, to reach across the battlefield and bring enemies back into the fold. As Lincoln looked ahead to peace, General Philip Sheridan carried war deep into the Shenandoah Valley. This region, known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy, had long been a strategic prize. In the fall of 1864, Sheridan's forces executed a devastating campaign, burning barns, crops, and infrastructure, crippling the South's food supply. This scorched earth approach mirrored Sherman's tactics in Georgia. It was controversial, but effective. These campaigns aimed not just to defeat Confederate armies, but to destroy their capacity to wage war. By the end of 1864, Union armies were advancing on nearly every front. Mobile Bay had fallen to Admiral David Farragut, whose cry of "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," became legend. Sherman had reached Savannah. Grant was entrenched outside Petersburg, and the Confederacy was shrinking, physically, economically, and spiritually. And yet, as the North looked toward victory, it could not have imagined the tragedy that would soon follow. Abraham Lincoln, the man guiding the nation through its darkest hours, was preparing to lead it into the light. But forces of hatred and vengeance still lingered in the shadows. In the next section, we'll follow the final months of the war, the fall of Richmond, the last desperate battles, and the surrender at Appomattox, culminating in an assassination that would alter the course of American history. By the beginning of 1865, the Confederacy was unraveling. Its armies were outnumbered, its railroads shattered, and its treasury nearly empty. In cities across the South, hunger, sorrow, and uncertainty weighed heavily. Meanwhile, the Union armies closed in from all directions, relentless, coordinated, and determined to bring the war to a decisive end. In Virginia, the siege of Petersburg dragged on into its 9th month. Union trenches extended for miles around the city, and daily artillery barrages wore down Confederate defenses. Robert E. Lee, still commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, hoped to hold the line as long as possible. But his once vaunted army was a shadow of itself. Supplies were scarce. Horses starved. Shoes were a luxury. Morale deteriorated. To the south, William Tecumseh Sherman had turned his attention from Georgia to the Carolinas. His Carolinas campaign, launched in early 1865, followed the same philosophy of total war that had brought Georgia to its knees. South Carolina, the state where secession had begun, now bore the brunt of retribution. Columbia, the capital, was occupied and partially burned. Railroads were twisted into Sherman's neckties. Mills and factories were destroyed. Sherman's army moved with speed and ruthlessness, dismantling the South's capacity to sustain resistance. Back in Washington, Abraham Lincoln had entered his second term with quiet resolve. Though he had led the Union through chaos, he still preached reconciliation, understanding that peace would not be lasting if built only on vengeance. His cabinet began discussing the terms of Reconstruction, how to reintegrate the southern states, how to protect the rights of newly freed people, and how to prevent future conflict. But before policies could be written, the war had to end. In March, Grant launched a final assault on Petersburg. The Union breakthrough came on April 2nd, 1865. Lee's lines collapsed. He informed Jefferson Davis that Richmond, the Confederate capital, could no longer be defended. That night, Davis and his cabinet fled. Fires broke out across the city as Confederate troops destroyed anything they could not carry. On April 3rd, Union troops marched into Richmond. The city, once the heart of the rebellion, was in ruins. In the days that followed, Lee retreated west with the remnants of his army, hoping to link up with other Confederate forces in North Carolina. Grant pursued him relentlessly. At every turn, Union cavalry cut off escape routes, captured supply trains, and blocked roads. Lee's men, exhausted and starving, dropped by the hundreds each day. On April 9th, 1865, near the small Virginia village of Appomattox Courthouse, Grant's forces finally cornered Lee. Realizing further resistance was hopeless, Lee requested a meeting. The surrender took place in the parlor of Wilmer McLean, a man whose former home had been the site of the war's first major battle at Bull Run. Now, its final chapter would be written in his new house. Grant, ever respectful in victory, offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers would lay down their arms but could return home. Officers were allowed to keep their sidearms and horses. There would be no trials for treason. Grant forbade his men from celebrating, saying, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." Lee, dressed immaculately, accepted the terms with dignity. When he mounted his horse and rode away, Union soldiers quietly removed their caps in respect. The fighting was not entirely over. Other Confederate forces remained in the field, but Lee's surrender marked the effective end of the Civil War. The North rejoiced. Bells rang out in cities and towns. Flags were unfurled. Prayers were said in churches. After 4 years of unimaginable loss, over 600,000 lives, the Union had been preserved. Lincoln,
always measured, greeted
the news with solemn satisfaction. He spoke from a White House balcony, urging the nation not to seek revenge, but to rebuild, to welcome the South back into the fold. He envisioned a new birth of freedom, in which the wounds of slavery could finally begin to heal. But not everyone welcomed this vision. On the night of April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theatre in Washington. In the middle of the performance, a well-known actor named John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer enraged by the defeat of the Confederacy and the liberation of enslaved people, entered the president's box. Booth shot Lincoln in the back of the head at point-blank range. The assassin leapt to the stage and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. He fled the scene, sparking one of the largest manhunts in American history. Lincoln was carried to a nearby boarding house, where he lingered through the night. On the morning of April 15th, at 7:22 a.m., Abraham Lincoln died. He was the first U.S. president to be assassinated. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had stayed by Lincoln's side through the night, whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." The nation was plunged into mourning. From the streets of Washington to the fields of Kansas, Americans wept. Funeral processions stretched for miles. In homes where Lincoln's name had once been cursed, candles were lit in grief. The war had ended, but the work of reconciliation, of reconstruction, of justice had only just begun. In the next part, we'll explore the aftermath of the Civil War, the challenges of reconstruction, the rise of new freedoms, and violent backlash, and how the scars of the conflict shaped the future of the United States for generations to come. As the terrible news of Abraham Lincoln's death spread across the country, a stunned silence fell over the Union. Church bells tolled, flags were draped in black, and thousands of Americans lined up to pay their respects. As the president's body was carried in a funeral procession that stretched from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois. It was one of the longest and most solemn journeys in American history. Lincoln's assassination had a profound effect, not only because he was the sitting president, but because of what he had come to represent. To millions of Americans, Lincoln was the guiding light through the storm. His calm demeanor, moral clarity, and unyielding commitment to unity had made him a symbol of the Union's highest ideals. His successor, Andrew Johnson, was a complex and divisive figure. A Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, Johnson was chosen as Lincoln's running mate in 1864 in a gesture of unity. But now, as president, Johnson faced the immense task of leading a fractured nation without Lincoln's steady hand or political skill. In the days following the assassination, the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators intensified. Booth fled south through Maryland and Virginia, aided by sympathizers. On April 26, 1865, Union soldiers surrounded a tobacco barn where Booth was hiding. When he refused to surrender, the barn was set ablaze, and Booth was shot by a soldier. He died hours later, whispering, "Useless, useless." The conspirators, who had plotted not only to kill Lincoln, but also Vice President Johnson and Secretary of State William H. Seward, were soon captured. 4 were hanged in July, including Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the US government. As justice was carried out, the nation turned its attention to the aftermath of the war. The Confederacy had been defeated, but the peace was fragile. The South lay in ruins, its cities charred, its economy devastated, and its labor system upended. Millions of formerly enslaved people now stood at a crossroads, free in name but uncertain in status. The 13th Amendment, passed by Congress in January and ratified by the states in December 1865, formally abolished slavery in the United States. But emancipation was only the beginning. Freedmen and women faced enormous challenges: where to live, how to find work, how to reunite with lost family members, and most of all, how to secure their newly won rights in a society that had denied their humanity for centuries. Across the South, federal troops occupied former Confederate states in a period known as Reconstruction. The federal government established the Freedmen's Bureau, tasked with helping formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, providing food, education, and legal assistance. Schools were opened, churches were founded, Black communities began to flourish against all odds. But resistance was fierce. Many white Southerners resented the presence of Union troops and the elevation of Black citizens. Secret organizations like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, spreading terror through intimidation and violence. Freedmen who dared to vote, attend school, or own land were often met with brutal retribution. President Johnson's approach to Reconstruction was lenient toward former Confederates. He quickly restored Southern governments, granted broad pardons, and opposed legislation aimed at protecting the rights of freed people. This put him at odds with the radical Republicans in Congress, who believed that the South must be fundamentally remade to ensure true equality. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law to African Americans. When Johnson vetoed it, Congress overrode his veto, a rare and dramatic act that signaled growing tension between the executive and legislative branches. The following year, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, enshrining civil rights in the Constitution. Still, progress was uneven, and the battle for equality would continue for more than a century. As 1865 came to a close, the nation stood at a crossroads. The war had ended, slavery had been abolished, and Lincoln had become a martyr for liberty. But the questions that loomed were no less urgent than those of 1861. What kind of country would America become? Would it fulfill the promises made on the battlefields of Gettysburg and Appomattox? Or would it slide back into division and injustice? In the next part, we'll explore the long and painful process of Reconstruction, how the Union tried to rebuild the South, how African Americans fought for their place in society, and how the legacies of the Civil War continued to echo through the generations. With the Civil War over and slavery abolished, the United States faced a new and daunting challenge: how to rebuild a shattered nation, reintegrate the former Confederate States, and establish justice for millions of newly freed African Americans. This period, known as Reconstruction, would prove to be one of the most turbulent and transformative eras in American history. At the heart of Reconstruction were three essential questions. How would the South be governed? What rights would freed people have? And who would control the process? Congress or the President? As 1865 progressed, President Andrew Johnson moved quickly to restore the Southern states to the Union. He offered broad pardons to former Confederates and allowed them to form new state governments with minimal federal oversight. By the end of the year, most of the former Confederate states had held constitutional conventions and rejoined the Union in name. But in practice, little had changed. These new Southern governments began enacting black codes, laws designed to restrict the freedom and rights of African Americans. These codes varied from state to state, but often included provisions that limited mobility, denied the right to vote, restricted access to education, and controlled labor contracts. Many codes essentially sought to recreate slavery under another name, tying freed people to plantations and white landowners through debt and coercion. Outraged, radical Republicans in Congress moved to assert their authority. Leaders, like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, argued that the South must be fundamentally transformed and that African Americans must be granted full citizenship and civil rights. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which declared all persons born in the United States, except Native Americans, to be citizens with equal rights. President Johnson vetoed the bill, but Congress overrode his veto. It was a remarkable act of defiance and marked the beginning of a fierce struggle between the executive and legislative branches. To cement these rights, Congress proposed the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868. It granted citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the U.S., promised equal protection under the law, and ensured due process. It also penalized states that denied the vote to any male citizens, laying the groundwork for further political reform. The next major push came in 1870 with the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which stated that the right to vote could not be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. With this, African American men, many of them former slaves, now held the right to vote, a revolutionary shift in American democracy. Across the South, African Americans began to participate in political life in unprecedented ways. They voted in large numbers, held public office, and formed organizations like the Union Leagues to promote political engagement and civil rights. During Reconstruction, Over 2,000 black men held public office at the local, state, and national levels. Hiram Revels, a minister and educator, became the first African American to serve in the U.S. Senate in 1870, representing Mississippi. But this progress was met with fierce and often violent resistance. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged to terrorize African Americans and their allies. Dressed in white robes and hoods, Klan members attacked black families at night, burned homes, and lynched individuals who dared to vote or hold office. Their goal was simple: restore white supremacy through fear and violence. The federal government responded with a series of enforcement acts aimed at crushing Klan activity. Federal troops were deployed in parts of the South, and hundreds of Klansmen were arrested. For a time, these efforts worked. The Klan was weakened, and voter participation among freedmen remained strong. But the tide was beginning to turn. The North's commitment to Reconstruction began to wane. Economic concerns, political fatigue, and a series of scandals in the Grant administration eroded public support. The Panic of 1873, a financial crisis that triggered a severe economic depression, further shifted attention away from the South. By the mid-1870s, white supremacists in the South had regrouped, forming new political coalitions under the banner of Redeemers. These groups used violence, fraud, and intimidation to suppress black voters and regain control of Southern state governments. One by one, Reconstruction governments fell. The final blow came in the presidential election of 1876. The race between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden was one of the most disputed in U.S. history. Tilden won the popular vote, but 20 electoral votes from several southern states were contested. To resolve the crisis, a backroom deal was struck: the Compromise of 1877. In exchange for conceding the presidency to Hayes, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Without federal oversight, Southern states quickly enacted Jim Crow laws, which institutionalized segregation and disenfranchised black citizens. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses ensured that African Americans were effectively stripped of the rights they had just gained. The dream of a multiracial democracy, so close to becoming real, was postponed for generations. Yet the legacy of Reconstruction endured. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments remained in the Constitution, waiting to be reawakened by future generations. The achievements of African American leaders during this period served as a beacon for the civil rights movements to come. In the next part, we'll explore how the Civil War and Reconstruction transformed the nation in ways that continue to resonate, from industrial expansion and constitutional change to the enduring struggles over memory, race, and the meaning of freedom. As the final veterans of the Civil War passed into memory, the conflict itself took on new forms, not on the battlefield, but in the stories people told about it. From the ashes of Reconstruction emerged a fierce battle over how the war would be remembered. This struggle over memory would shape American culture, politics, and identity for more than a century. In the North, the Union victory had secured the nation's survival and ended slavery. But the meaning of that victory soon became muddled. By the end of the 19th century, the dominant narrative among white Americans was not one of emancipation or justice. It was a story of reunion. This reconciliationist narrative downplayed the role of slavery and highlighted the bravery of soldiers on both sides. Memorial Day ceremonies, monuments, and school books began to portray the war as a tragic conflict between brothers rather than a moral struggle over human bondage. The focus shifted from emancipation to unity. For many in the North, the horrors of Reconstruction were forgotten or ignored. For many in the South, they were recast as evidence of Northern overreach and corruption. Nowhere was this clearer than in the rise of the Lost Cause myth. The Lost Cause was a narrative that emerged in the post-war South, idealizing the Confederacy and its leaders. It painted the war not as a defense of slavery, but as a noble effort to protect states' rights and preserve a cherished way of life. Figures like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were lionized as honorable men fighting for principle rather than property. This myth served several purposes. It offered Southern whites a way to cope with defeat and humiliation. It justified the reimposition of white supremacy during Jim Crow. And it became a powerful cultural force, reflected in novels like Gone with the Wind, in Confederate monuments, and in public school curricula. At the same time, African Americans and a smaller number of Northern historians worked to preserve the true legacy of the war. Black communities honored emancipation in Juneteenth celebrations. Black veterans formed their own Grand Army of the Republic Posts and wrote memoirs to document their service. But their voices were often marginalized in the national conversation. By the early 20th century, the Civil War had been refashioned into a romantic epic, stripped of its most painful truths. The Ku Klux Klan resurged in the 1910s and 1920s, often under the banner of Confederate memory. Statues of Confederate generals appeared across Southern cities, not during or immediately after the war, but decades later, during the height of segregation. These public symbols reflected power. They weren't just about honoring the dead. They were about asserting a racial and political order. For many, they served as daily reminders of exclusion. Still, there were countercurrents. In the 1930s and 40s, Black scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois challenged the Lost Cause and told the story of black soldiers, freedmen, and radical Republicans. They argued that Reconstruction had been a noble effort, thwarted by white backlash. Their work laid the groundwork for later generations. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement brought renewed attention to the unfinished work of the Civil War. Activists invoked Lincoln, the 14th Amendment, and the promises made at Gettysburg. Court rulings, legislation, and public protests demanded that America live up to its founding ideals. Monuments came under scrutiny. School curriculums were challenged. History itself became a battleground. In the 21st century, the debates have continued. Statues have been removed. Flags have been lowered. States have reconsidered the symbols they display and the holidays they celebrate. Yet the struggle over how to remember the Civil War remains unresolved. Because at its core, the war was never just about cannons and battles. It was about ideas, freedom, equality, union, and justice. It was about what kind of nation America would become. And in that sense, the Civil War never truly ended. Its echoes can still be heard in our politics, our institutions, and our streets. In the final part, we'll reflect on the enduring meaning of the Civil War, how it shaped the American character, what it teaches us about conflict and reconciliation, and why remembering it truthfully matters more than ever. The American Civil War remains the most defining and transformative event in the nation's history. It was a crucible of pain and principle, a reckoning not just between regions, but between ideals and realities, between the promises of democracy and the brutal weight of human bondage. More than 620,000 people lost their lives, more than in any other conflict in US history. Countless more were wounded, displaced, or forever changed. Cities were burned, landscapes altered, and generations haunted by memories of battlefield horror. And yet, from that devastation emerged a new, if fragile, version of the United States. The Union was preserved. The Constitution was redefined. Slavery was abolished. And the idea that all people are created equal was written not only in principle, but finally, if imperfectly, into law. But the war did not finish the work of justice. It set the stage, it carved a path, and it handed down a task. In his Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln asked whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could long endure. In that moment, the outcome was uncertain, but today, more than 150 years later, the question still echoes. Because the Civil War wasn't just a 19th century event, it was a mirror held up to the country's soul. It revealed deep divisions, regional, racial, economic, that still ripple through society. It revealed the consequences of injustice left unaddressed, of compromise built on the backs of the oppressed. It revealed, too, the incredible courage of those who fought to create a better world, who laid down their lives so that others might stand free. The legacy of the Civil War lives on not just in textbooks or cemeteries, but in debates about civil rights, federal power, voting access, and historical memory. It lives in the marches of protesters, the decisions of courts, the pages of legislation, and the hard work of teachers, students, and citizens committed to truth. Remembering the Civil War is not about nostalgia. It's not about valorizing uniforms or tactics. It's about understanding the cost of division and the power of unity. It's about honoring the dead not just with statues or flags, but with action, with a continued commitment to liberty, equality, and justice for all. It's about listening to the full story, not just the comforting myths, but the painful truths. Because only by doing so can we ensure that the sacrifices made in those years were not in vain. Today, we still stand in Lincoln's unfinished work. The great task remaining before us continues to perfect our union, to extend freedom more fully, to live up to the ideals for which so many gave their lives. The Civil War was fought with muskets and sabers, but its real battlefield was the American conscience. And in many ways, that battle is still being waged. Let us fight it not with bullets, but with understanding, not with hatred, but with humility. Let us learn, let us teach, let us remember, not just what happened, but why it happened. And let us never forget that a house divided can still stand, if we choose together to build it stronger. Thank you for listening.